When we're talking about compliance, we're talking about a continuum of response. Most of us, I'm sure all of us, have gone along with things when we felt uncomfortable. And compliance is kind of on one end of it where there's a form of freeze. We go into freeze and we don't really know what to do. And sometimes we'll do it to curry favor with somebody who we see as more powerful. Sometimes it's pretty benign. It's just kind of getting along. And other times there's more of a risk to it, or we're more going against what we really believe. Then on the other end of that continuum is people who automatically reject doing what we're told. And defiance can be a form of the fight response, which makes sense when we're told to do something that we don't want to do, or when we're put in that kind of a situation where we'll fight against somebody putting pressure on us. Peer pressure is one of those things that really still affects us. As I've had a couple of experiences this week as well of feeling pressured into something that put me at a different kind of risk than I was comfortable with. It really made me kind of stop and look at it and think, well, why is it that we comply? And it's so much hooked up with our survival systems that we're hardwired through millions of years of evolution to fit in. And because if we don't fit in and we're kicked out of the community or our family, then we're not going to survive. Individuals didn't very often survive on their own. We needed the company of other people to stay safe. And that primitive brain, that survival system impulse is still alive. We think about teenagers as being the ones that are really susceptible to that. But in fact, often it's adults as well. And then we can also fit in outside of the mainstream. So sometimes we'll define our membership through an alternative community, like in the lesbian community, for instance. I didn't fit in with the mainstream community, but I fit in with that community. And then that becomes our family, our people that we care about, and the people that we can't risk going against. And so you get into political correctness and different things. And so some examples of that are the freedom riders and the civil rights movement. A lot of them were white people that came down from the North. There were certainly Black people in that movement as well. The white people that were in the movement were going against the ideas of the mainstream, often of their parents and their peers who didn't believe in equality for people of different races, for instance. So the Stonewall Uprising in 1969 was in the LGBTQ community where they violently opposed the arrests that were happening in the bars in New York City. And then Occupy Wall Street in 2011, which I thought was such an exciting movement that didn't really have the momentum to keep going, unfortunately. But they were really looking at who owns us. The 1% own most of the world's resources, and that's not right. And so now we're coming around with that pandemic to look at that and go, yeah, are we more than cogs in a machine? Do the billionaires actually care about these economic units that we consider to be ourselves, to be people? And so that's becoming really clear. And then I start looking at developing autonomy. So teens are certainly more sensitive to peer pressure, and that's what we kind of think. But as an adult, we're susceptible to it too because of that survival mechanism. And it might be things like going back to a school reunion or something like that. People are wanting to prove that they've been successful, or keeping up with the Joneses, wanting to have the right kind of car, being embarrassed by living in a certain area compared to other people that we're friends with living in a different area. And so some of these decisions that we make around compliance are based on that inclusion factor, which is, I think, a lot more pervasive than what we might have been thinking it was. So now here we are with the pandemic. and we have conflicting information to some extent. Although I think if we're looking at information from the World Health Organization and different government bodies that are reliable, then there's not a lot of conflict in that. But there are certainly a lot of people who are feeling like this is a conspiracy, it's a hoax. The numbers right now for the United States are close to 100,000 people have died. And those are the ones that have been identified as having died of COVID-19. And there's still some people that are saying, well, no, that's not true. It's some global conspiracy to take our rights from us. The determination of risk involves who do we listen to and how do we know who's trustworthy. So if you're in a bubble where all of the experts are being slammed and where there's just this erosion of trust and there's this paranoia and suspicion about medical doctors and scientists and what they have to say, then you're not going to be taking in the same kind of information. You're not going to be open to knowing about the science of it. And without firsthand experience, as the pandemic continues to move out into communities and more people then start to hear about, okay, that neighbor or my cousin, or I just found out yesterday my nephew has COVID-19. So once it starts to filter into families and communities, then it's going to be harder for people to believe that it's a hoax. But in some bubbles, there's a kind of a scorn for people who believe it's a hoax. In other bubbles, there's a scorn for people that are taking it so seriously and we're overreacting. And there's a lot of polarization, and the polarization we've been talking about for years now has really come to the fore with COVID-19. So here's where we make a decision. We decide on what kind of action we're going to take, whether we're going to wear a mask or not, whether we're going to go back to work in a certain location, whether we're going to socially distance, whether we're going to include certain people into our bubble that we're going to be not distancing from. And so we've decided on an action. And now, whatever action we take, wherever we are on that action, it's going to have some level of social risk of disapproval. And one thing that we've been talking about is how it's kind of hard to get our heads around the fact that so many people have such different views on this. What an acceptable risk is to one person is not at all acceptable to another person. Part of the reason that this feels so important to us is because someone else's assessment of their risk directly affects our health and directly affects our risk. And so if we're in a store with somebody who refuses to wear a mask, their not wearing a mask could put us in danger. So that's part of why tempers are so hot and people are taking this so seriously and people are so committed to whatever their position is because it feels like it's a risk. And for people who are feeling like their freedoms are being taken away, it would feel like a risk from their end too. People who are wearing masks, if that becomes the norm, then they're going to be forced maybe to do that as well, or they're going to be rebelling against that. So everywhere that you are on the spectrum, it seems like there's an elevated level of intensity. So a lot of what we work with trauma is our window of tolerance. And one of the things about this is that with the inquiries that we do, we always want to be within our window of tolerance. And part of what that means is we always know that we're in this moment in time. When we talk about sitting with something, being in awareness, doing inquiry from awareness, what that means in part is that we're here in this moment and we know we're here in this moment. So if we don't know that, if we're past our window of tolerance, then we're back in the past probably, or we're in the future with catastrophic thinking. So deciding on what to do and how to do it has a direct impact on our window of tolerance. And so as we're going out and wearing our mask, if we're in an environment where nobody else is or very few other people are, we're going to feel uncomfortable. If we are not wearing a mask and everybody else is, we're going to feel uncomfortable. So when you made a decision for yourself, how comfortable are you to hold your ground with some kind of calmness? So let's stop here for a moment and have a look at that. So one of the things that happens is that other people don't know why we've made our decisions. They don't have any idea why this is the decision that we made. We have that kind of feeling of, well, I'm at higher risk because of this, or I made a decision for that reason, but we don't get to actually tell people that. We don't get to actually share this is my reasoned process for making the decision. So that's another part that makes it feel more uncomfortable. People don't know the background. We don't know if somebody has an autoimmune disease unless it's obvious by looking at them. So the two questions just on this slide are, do you generally go into compliance or defiance? So let's start with that one. So if you're in a situation where you're feeling like someone wants you to do something different than what you're wanting to do, what do you generally do? Do you go into freeze compliance or do you go into defiance and anger? And how extreme is that? So it might be go a little bit out there and come back, or it might be that sometimes you're triggered into going way into that. You go right into compliance and you just kind of don't even think, well, I've already made that decision and here I am doing something different. We're going to get into all of the pressures on us in a moment. But just to, as an overall kind of a large picture, what's your tolerance for calmly holding your ground? So you've made a decision. It's not something that somebody around you is happy about. They're not supportive, or you're feeling uncomfortable somehow. What is your ability to stay with that? And notice how that might come up in your body. There might be energy, there might be thoughts, or you might feel like you're going into freeze or fight. What is your tolerance for holding your ground? People have different levels of tolerance for feeling fear. And this is what it really boils down to. What's going on is it's a fear based reaction. So, all of us are afraid when something like this is going on. If you're a human being, you have a nervous system that wants to keep you alive and it's fighting for that. And so, fear is something that is natural to feel. And some of us are having trouble sleeping, some of us more irritable. Most of us are noticing more contracted kind of tightness in our body. And then sometimes people go into more catastrophic thinking. I've noticed for myself that I'm well versed in noticing it when it's starting to happen and then stopping it. But the impulse is still more than it usually is. And then emotionally flooded means it's a chemical reaction in our body. It's cortisone and adrenaline that are caused by a fear response, some kind of a activated response that takes about 15 or 20 minutes to settle. And so if we notice that we're having that, that's a good thing because then we could do something to wait and to support ourselves through that. So when I had something happen when I was in the city on Tuesday, I knew I was emotionally flooded and I deliberately gave myself 20 minutes before I went and did the next thing on my list so that I could down regulate my system. So I did some breathing, I did some throwing it down into the ground. I did some different things that I knew would help. And then when I felt calmer, then I was able to continue on. But the thing about being emotionally flooded is that we don't really have access to our prefrontal cortex and our thinking brain. And that's when we're more likely to react out of our primitive brain. So it's not ideal when we're feeling that way. So we've all seen and been talking about how extreme things are. At the same time as many people are drinking more, there's more drugs, there's more overdoses by drug use, domestic violence is up, and some of those really distressing results of avoiding fear are coming up. And then many people talk about Netflix and different ways that they're escaping. You see a lot more people talking about food and gaining weight and fear of gaining weight. Then we're also seeing that a lot of people are really interested in meditation and breathing and how do I actually calm my system down. So things that might not have been so obvious before are now really obvious. And so that brings up an opportunity for people to work with their mind, to work with their nervous system. And there's a ton of things online for that right now that are being really utilized, which is wonderful too. So we're seeing both. We're seeing this possibilities around managing fear and some interest in that. You can tell a lot by the memes on Facebook about what people are doing of these dogs that are going, "Oh my gosh, I wish my owner would get back to work. I'm tired from these 10 walks a day." But people have this impulse to get out in nature and walk and exercise. Some of the shelters are empty because people have adopted all the pets and people are pulling together as a team. And so there's that at the same time as there's that desperate unhappiness that a lot of people are experiencing in their families. It's really, again, all of this is very evident and very, very stark. We're really seeing that. So we have these elevated nervous systems. We're feeling more hypervigilance and we're feeling more vulnerable to being shamed. And that's part of what's happening with the higher levels of fear. We're just more vulnerable and we really want connection. And that might be something that we can't get right now. And I was talking to somebody who was saying he was talking with two of his neighbors in the backyard, and neither one of them were wearing a mask, and neither one of them were standing 6 feet away from each other. So he was 6 feet away from them, but they weren't 6 feet away from each other. And he said they were making little comments to make him feel kind of stupid that he was following the social distancing. So the two of them were ganging up on him in a not in a totally aggressive way, but in a kind of a shaming way. And we feel awkward when that happens. Like we feel that pressure of, in order to be included in the club, I need to do what they're doing. These are all men in their 40s to 60s. So they're not teenagers, they're not adolescents, but it's still that kind of social pressure is going on. And so another way that shaming happens too is that I think people in my bubble tend to look at people who are not wearing masks and sometimes will shame them for being uneducated or they don't know what the facts are, or they're resistant to facts. And I've had some actually really well meaning people assume that the reason I want to social distance is because I'm afraid. They're kind of thinking that I must be wanting to do that because my nervous system is too activated and I can't enjoy being out. And they're not really getting it that what I'm doing is making a decision based on the facts as I see them, determining what level of risk I want to have, and that it's not a fear based, it's a risk assessment based decision. And so these things can be really subtle. They don't have to be those harsh words that get said. A lot of times it's a look on someone's face or how they back away from us or those kinds of more subtle social shaming that happens. So with bullying, I just wanted to bring this in as a reminder that if we've ever been the target of bullying or social shunning or shaming, then this is going to be a lot harder for us. So our past experience is what our nervous system knows, and that it reacts more strongly to it. If you've had experiences in the past of this kind of thing, then you're going to be feeling more pressure to be in sync with your family and neighbors, or you're going to be feeling more defiance or more denial, or all kinds of ways that we're trying to manage that, but that it reduces our window of tolerance for standing our ground because we had, in our own direct experience, we've had negative consequences for that. So, on one hand, we risk getting the virus. On the other hand, we risk social exclusion. Helping others feel better and compliance comes with a high cost right now. So, in the past, it might have come with a social cost, but now it comes with a cost of we might get the virus. So, that becomes a much more elevated level of risk than what we used to feel. So, let's go into the inquiries now. So, the Kilby inquiries, we use the reverse inquiry a lot because it helps us to bring forward our unconscious beliefs about something. So we've made a decision. Let's look at staying grounded and steady in our decision. So we've decided we're going to limit our exposure to somebody or wear the mask or whatever it is that we do. So let's look at this inquiry and see what comes up for us. And as you're doing it, if it feels like it's too much, then just open your eyes, stop doing the inquiry. You can do some tapping on your forehead and bring your attention into the sound and sensation of the tapping. You could put the images or words up on a frame on the other side of the room. Keep your eyes open. But just to see what comes up and really notice your breath and your body as we start. So we always want to remain present in this moment. So take a few breaths. Let your shoulders settle. So the reverse inquiry is I am unmoved by other people's opinions of my decision about exposure risk. So I am unmoved by other people's opinions. And most likely there's a no. Notice if it comes up in thoughts. If it's energy in the body, if it is, then bring your attention into the energy and stay with that. I am unmoved by other people's opinions of my decision around exposure risk. And one thing that might come up would be a need for reassurance. There might be a kind of a scared part of you that really needs you to say, hey, you know what? It's okay for you to be worried about this. We need to be on our own side. And here's some other inquiries if these have any resonance. I don't need others to agree with me. Or I can tolerate being not in agreement with friends and family. I can tolerate having a different opinion. I don't have a need to explain or defend my decisions. And stay really present in your body. Notice your breath. We notice what comes up as thoughts, energy in the body. I don't have a need to explain or defend my decisions. I don't need others to agree with me. And these are inquiries we could come back and look at many times, especially after something's happened or if we have something coming to mind now. And when we say a sentence like that, that's the reverse of what we feel is true, it really does help us to bring forward our objections to that. And to balance the people who we feel shamed by or the people who we don't feel in sync with, it's good to remember that we all have more fear right now and we're all more vulnerable to social pressure than we usually are. So it's going to be higher stakes as well because it's life and death. It's not just social inclusion now. If we get the virus, we could be very sick from it. We might die from it. And even if you're in a situation where you feel like you don't have any support, it might just be that the people who agree with you and would support you aren't in the situation. So maybe you're in a at the entrance to a store and the person says, "You can't come in here without a mask." And you might really need something that's in that store and you decide to go in anyway, but you're fuming inside, or you might turn around and walk away. There's a lot of people who don't agree with that. It's just that they're not here right now. So when we feel alone in a decision or we feel alone when we're in a situation like that, it's not that we're actually the only one who feels that way. It's just that maybe our support aren't there at the moment. And that many people can find empathy and respect for people who make different decisions. And so sometimes we're scorned for having a different decision, or we're kind of subtly shamed for wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, or for making social distancing decisions, all of those things. But ideally, we can find a way to have empathy and respect for people who have different decisions that we do. And to recognize that that's really hard right now because the impact of those decisions that everybody's making doesn't make sense to us. It's really hard to see how somebody could disregard science, for instance, and make the kind of decisions they are. And we might have opinions about that. We might like, well, they're in denial or they can't see the truth or whatever. So we might be judging them as well. And so it's hard work to remain kind of steady and kind and respectful of ourselves and of other people as well. So we're really called on right now to grow and be mature and to stand steady. And so one of the things that we can consider as we're going through this is that there's an opportunity here. Our fears are really coming forward right now. And it's not enough to just look at them and be present with them. We can also have the optimism and the knowing that we can actually reduce our fear, that when we work with the nervous system, we can downregulate our nervous system, and that these tools and these practices that we do make a big difference. And then as we strengthen our capacity to stay steady and to tolerate social pressure from other people, then that really helps everybody else as well. But we get the freedom. So this might be the perfect opportunity to really work at our capacity. And sometimes we're not going to have the capacity. Sometimes we're just going to be, I need to get through this and hopefully without shaming myself. And I need to get my body to a safe place. And then I'm going to be able to settle after that. But as we work through this, we're not giving up, that we don't have to give up, that this is a chance for us to come forward and be strong and steady and wise and help other people and help ourselves and be on our own side. And there's a lot of opportunity here as well as difficulty.